There is a reel of magnetic tape sitting in the archive collection of a private music historian in Los Angeles that has no official catalog number, no label, no date written on its outer casing. It was found in 1994 at the bottom of a cardboard box that had passed through 4 different storage facilities in the 23 years since Jim Morrison's death, accumulating the specific kind of institutional invisibility that attaches itself to objects that no one has been asked to look for. The archivist who found it, a woman named Carol Sievert, who had spent 3 years organizing the remnants of Elektra Records' late 1960s session documentation, almost set it aside without listening. It was unlabeled. It was clearly old. It sat at the bottom of a box of otherwise catalogued material, like something that had been deliberately placed at the bottom of a box of otherwise catalogued material. She listened to it on a Tuesday afternoon in November 1994, alone in a listening room, and she sat for a very long time afterward before she told anyone what she had heard. The box itself was unremarkable, the kind of standard archive box that the music industry generated in enormous quantities during the late 1960s and early 1970s, when the transition from analog to more systematic storage practices was producing a generation of documentation that was carefully labeled on its outside and casually organized on its inside. Sievert had opened perhaps 400 such boxes in the preceding 3 years. She had not found anything like this. What she had heard was Jim Morrison singing a song that no one had ever heard him sing, not on any released album, not on any bootleg recording, not in any concert footage, a song that, as far as anyone in the subsequent years of careful research has been able to determine, he performed exactly once, in an Elektra Studio session in late 1968, in the presence of the band and the session engineer, recorded onto a reel of tape that he then asked to be erased, in a voice that the engineer who was present later described as quiet and without performance, the voice of someone speaking directly rather than singing. Or singing as a form of speaking rather than as a form of performing. The tape was not erased, and the question of why it was not erased, and what Jim Morrison did and did not know about its survival, and what the song itself revealed about the man inside the mythology, these questions form the center of one of the most quietly remarkable stories in the history of recorded music. The story exists at an intersection that the music industry rarely navigates well, the intersection between what an artist created, what an artist intended, and what survives regardless of intention. Most of the time, these 3 things align closely enough that the intersection is not a problem, but occasionally, rarely, and with a significance that the rarity amplifies, the 3 things diverge. The created thing is not what was intended, or the survival is not what was intended, and the divergence becomes the story. The session in question took place in October 1968. The Doors were in the process of recording what would become the Soft Parade, their 4th studio album, a record whose production history was complicated by the tensions that had been accumulating within the band since the explosion of fame that followed the first 2 albums. Jim was in a difficult period, not dramatically so, not in the ways that would later characterize the Miami months and their aftermath, but in the quieter, more corrosive way of someone who has been producing at high intensity for 2 years and is beginning to feel the specific exhaustion that sustained output at the expense of private renewal produces. He was writing in his notebooks, he was reading, he was performing with the band and feeling more and more that the performance and the writing were happening in separate rooms of himself that were not in communication. The other Doors, Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, John Densmore, had grown accustomed to Jim arriving at sessions with unexpected material, songs that had appeared between the previous session and this one, lyrics that hadn't been discussed and sometimes didn't fit anything the band had been working on, but that Jim needed to try in the room, in the presence of the instruments and the people, before he could know what they were. This was part of the process, and the band had developed a patience with it that was itself a form of love. Manzarek had developed, across 2 years of working with Jim in the studio, a particular sensitivity to the difference between Jim arriving with material that was ready and Jim arriving with material that was still becoming, still finding its form, still uncertain of what it needed from the other musicians and from the space of performance to complete itself. The October 1968 session had the feel, from its opening minutes, of the second category. Jim was present but interior, moving through the studio with the slightly distracted quality of someone whose attention is divided between the room and somewhere else entirely. What happened in that studio that evening was different in quality from anything the band had experienced in 2 years of sessions, and none of them were prepared for it. What happened was different in quality from the usual unexpected arrivals. Jim came into the studio later than the scheduled call time. He sat for a while without speaking. He asked for the room to be cleared of everyone except the band and the session engineer, whose name was Bruce Botnik, a request that was unusual, because Jim was generally indifferent to the presence of studio personnel in ways that more controlling artists were not. Botnik cleared the room. The 4 band members and the engineer were alone. Jim asked Botnik to run the tape. Not to set up a specific configuration, just to run the tape, to have the machine recording whatever happened in the room. Botnik ran the tape, and then Jim Morrison did something that none of the people present had seen him do in 2 years of recording sessions. He sang something completely unprepared, without giving the band any signal or instruction, without establishing a key or a tempo, without any of the usual scaffolding that a recording session provides. He simply began. What he sang was not a song in the conventional structural sense. It had verses and something approaching a chorus, but the structure was loose, almost conversational, the melody following the words rather than the words following the melody. It was, by the accounts of those present, a song about his mother, not the symbolic mother of mythology or the psychological mother of Freudian analysis, but the specific woman who had raised him in a series of military housing units across the American South and West, who had loved him in the particular way that military wives love difficult children, with a combination of fierce protectiveness and genuine bafflement at the person who had emerged from her, who bore her features and her husband's discipline, and yet was entirely, persistently, inexplicably something else. The song described specific things, a specific kitchen, a specific afternoon, a specific conversation that had not gone well and had been left unresolved in the way that conversations between parents and children who speak different languages are left unresolved, not with hostility, but with the mutual acknowledgement of a gap that neither party knew how to close. It described his mother's hands. It described the sound of a particular radio station that played in the background of a particular house during a particular summer. It described the specific quality of her silence when she was worried about him, which was different from the silence of disapproval and different again from the silence of acceptance, in which he had spent years trying to name without finding the right word. The band did not play. Ray Manzarek later described the experience of sitting at his keyboards and not touching them as one of the most deliberate acts of restraint he had ever performed in a musical context. The understanding that the song required silence around it, that accompaniment would reduce rather than amplify what was happening, that Jim was doing something that the usual architecture of rock music was not equipped to support. Robbie Krieger and John Densmore were similarly still. Bruce Botnik ran the tape and did not move. For the duration of the song, which lasted, by the tape's own record, 7 minutes and 14 seconds, the only sound in the room was Jim Morrison's voice and the ambient presence of the studio itself. The song was not, by any technical measure, finished. But finished was not the right category for what was happening. What was happening was not a performance in the sense that required finishing. It was something closer to a disclosure, a controlled collapse of the usual architecture of presentation, a moment in which the space between private and public was briefly abolished, and what existed in private was allowed to exist once in the presence of others. When the song ended, there was silence for a period that multiple accounts place at somewhere between 30 seconds and 2 full minutes. The accounts vary because time behaves differently in the presence of genuine art. It expands and compresses in ways that measuring instruments don't capture. Then Jim looked at Bruce Botnik and said, quietly, "Erase it," not as a question. Not with explanation. Botnik said yes. He said yes in the way that people say yes to things they are not entirely sure they will do, the compliance of someone who needs more time before he knows what the right action actually is. Jim went to the bathroom. The band sat in the silence of the room, which had acquired a different quality from the silence before the song, the particular quality of a space that has held something large and is now holding its memory. When Jim came back, they continued with the scheduled session. Nobody mentioned the song, nobody asked about it, nobody said what they had just heard or what they thought it meant. They did the work they had come to do and then they left. Ray Manzarek later said that he understood in that silence after the song something about Jim that 2 years of close professional collaboration had not fully revealed, that the person who walked onto concert stages and inhabited the mythology of the Lizard King with such apparent completeness was doing so from a position of genuine bifurcation, that there was a self that performed and a self that did not, and that the self that did not was more essential, and that the song they had just heard had come from that self directly. The song was not material for an album. It was not material for a performance. It was material for nothing except itself, the private creative practice asserting itself in a semi-public space and then, immediately, retreating back into privacy and asking that the evidence of the assertion be destroyed. Botnik did not erase the tape that evening. He told himself he would erase it the following morning before the next session because the tape would be needed and the material on it was not part of the official session record, and there was no reason to keep it. The following morning, he arrived at the studio early and sat with the tape in his hands for a while before putting it back in the box without erasing it. He thought about the question of erasure in the days that followed. Not obsessively, not with the quality of someone in the grip of a moral crisis, but with the patient, recurring consideration of a person who understands that a decision made quickly will be the wrong decision, and that the right decision, if there is one, requires the kind of time that quick decisions don't allow. He never erased it. He never told anyone it existed. He put it in a box and let the box go where boxes go when the people responsible for them move on, into storage, into the slow drift that carries things from relevance to irrelevance, and occasionally, unpredictably, back again. Jim Morrison died in July 1971 without knowing whether the tape had been erased. The question of what he believed, whether he trusted that Botnik had followed his instruction, or whether he harbored some uncertainty about it, or whether he had, in the particular way of people who create things they are not ready to share, chosen not to ask and not to think about the answer, is not answerable from the available evidence. What is answerable is that he never mentioned the song again, not to Botnik, not to the band, not in his notebooks, which contain no reference to an October 1968 studio session involving unrecorded material. The song existed, was performed once, was asked to be erased, and then was not mentioned again, as though Jim had decided that the asking was sufficient, and that the tape was gone from the world as surely as if the oxide particles carrying his voice had been physically scrambled. Carol Sievert listened to the tape alone in November 1994 and then sat for a long time. She was not a Jim Morrison devotee. She was an archivist trained in the discipline of treating discovered material with the careful neutrality that the discipline requires, not projecting onto it, not allowing the significance of the discovery to overwhelm the methodological precision that makes discovery meaningful rather than merely exciting. She listened a second time. She took notes. She verified through subsequent research and consultation with those who had been present at the October 1968 session that what she had found was what it appeared to be. Then she sat with the question of what to do with it. She also thought about the other musicians. Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore had been present. They had heard what she had now heard, in the room rather than through magnetic oxide on a reel. They had made no public reference to the session in the decades since. They had honored in their silence something that she now found herself in possession of and responsible for. The question is not simple, and it has not become simpler in the years since she first confronted it. Jim Morrison asked for the tape to be erased. He asked this clearly, without equivocation, in the presence of witnesses. The tape was not erased. Its survival is the result of a technician's decision not to follow an instruction, a decision made out of a genuine artistic response to what he had heard rather than any commercial calculation. Bruce Botnik has never claimed credit for saving the tape. He has described his failure to erase it as something closer to an inability than a decision, the paralysis of a person confronted with an object whose destruction they find themselves unable to enact, regardless of the instruction to enact it. What the tape contains, what the 7 minutes and 14 seconds of Jim Morrison singing about his mother in an empty studio in October 1968 actually sound like, has not been publicly released. The decision about what to do with the tape has not been resolved in the 3 decades since its discovery. It exists in a legal and ethical space that the music industry's standard frameworks are not well designed to navigate, the space between a creator's expressed wish for destruction and a listener's genuine conviction that what was created is too valuable to destroy. This space has no clean answer. It has only the specific weight of a specific case, a man, a studio, a song he sang once, a request that was not honored, and the question of what we owe to artists who tell us clearly what they do not want the world to hear. What the tape's existence does resolve, with a clarity that its contents alone could provide, is the question of what Jim Morrison was doing in his private creative practice in the years when the public mythology was at its most consuming. He was writing songs about his mother. He was sitting in a studio with people he trusted and singing the truest things he knew in a voice stripped of all the equipment that performance provides. He was asking for the evidence to be destroyed immediately afterward, not because he was ashamed of what he had made, but because what he had made was so genuinely his, so completely private, so entirely outside the territory that his public artistic identity had staked out, that sharing it with the world felt like a violation of something he needed to keep inviolate. He was protecting the source, the part of himself from which the music came, the part that the mythology could not reach or consume or turn into a symbol. The tape still exists. Carol Sievert has it. The question of what should be done with it is the question that has no answer, that doesn't cost something real. To release it is to override a dead man's clearly expressed wish. To destroy it is to complete an instruction that a living man chose not to follow. To keep it in a box is the thing that has been done so far, and it is the thing that preserves the question in its full and unresolvable complexity, which is perhaps the most honest available response to a situation that honesty cannot simplify. Jim Morrison sang a song once. He asked for it to be erased. Was not erased, and the song, whatever it says about the man who made it, about the mother he was singing to, about the private creative practice that existed beneath the public mythology, is still there, in a private archive in Los Angeles, carrying his voice through the decades in the specific and irreversible way that magnetic tape carries voices. Not perfectly, not permanently, but for now, long enough that the question it raises has had time to become the question it actually is. That question is not what is on the tape. It is what we owe to the living wishes of the dead, and what we owe to the art they made in spite of themselves, and what happens when these two obligations cannot be honored simultaneously. Jim Morrison understood both obligations. He honored the second one every time he performed, every time he published a poem, every time he stepped into a studio and gave the world access to what his interior life had produced. And he honored the first one, or tried to, in an October studio in 1968 when he asked for the tape to be erased. The person he asked made a different choice, and that different choice has left us here with a question and no clean answer, which is perhaps exactly where Jim Morrison would have expected us to end up.